my pleasure to welcome you today to our webinar entitled The Gulf in the Crossfire, Assessing the GCC's High-Stakes Calculus and the Region's Future After the Iran War. This is our second in a series of webinars on the Iran conflict, which I note is being called the Iran conflict or the Iran war, not the Gulf War, even though it involves the Gulf countries more than Gulf War I and Gulf War II. We are delighted to have you join us for what promises to be a timely and substantive discussion on a region, once again at the center of global strategic attention and global economic and business attention. As a moment marked by heightened frictions between Washington, Tehran, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and the involvement now of 25 countries kinetically, with the addition of South Korea, action at the United Nations with the resolutions sponsored by Bahrain and Jordan, and fears around the globe of catastrophic outcomes amidst hopes that we'll get to a quick resolution. We are bringing together today distinguished analysts and practitioners from the region, from the United States, with expertise on all of the pieces of the puzzle that we are going to try to unwind today. We are very privileged today to have as our moderator a longtime friend of the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, Abderrahim Foukara, who recently stepped down from a position as Washington Bureau Chief of Al Jazeera, and previously as host of Min Washington, its Al Jazeera's flagship program. And he has now agreed to work with the Council on some of our events now and going forward. And we are just so privileged to have one of the great interviewers in international media stewarding our program today. And we have many questions to get to. So I'm going to ask Abderrahim to take over and introduce the speakers. We have a wonderful lineup for you today, and we hope that you can get some questions sent to us as noted on the announcement. Nakusar questions at nakusar.org, I believe, and we send your questions as noted in the announcement. And over to you, Abderrahim.
Thank you very much, Dr. William Lawrence, for those very kind words. It is my absolute pleasure to join the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations and QUSAR in this very, very important webinar, as you suggested. And I reiterate your greetings and mine to everybody who's following this webinar, wherever they may be in the world, in the United States, in the Gulf, or elsewhere on this big turbulent planet at the present time. I am very delighted to introduce our featured speakers. We have Mr. Faisal Abbas, Editor-in-Chief, Arab News, Saudi Arabia. Ambassador Michael Gaffala, independent consultant on international politics and economics. He is a former Chargé d'Affaires, U.S. Embassy in Riyadh. We also have Dr. Norman Rule, non-resident senior advisor, Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. He's also a former Iran intelligence manager, Directorate of National Intelligence. With us also, Mr. David Randell. He is the author of Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. He's a former chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh. And last but not least, Dr. Sarah Bakhshuri, Center for Energy Security and Diplomacy Chair, Institute for World Peace. She is founder and president, SVB Energy International. Welcome to all of you. And again, welcome to everybody following this webinar. Let me start you off to warm you up a little bit with a general question. How would each one of you characterize the current phase of the conflict? Is this a controlled escalation? Is it still containable? Or are events slipping beyond anyone's control? If I could start with Mr. Faisal Abbas.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm delighted to be among the company of such distinguished speakers. It is, as you rightly pointed out, we're going through a very critical period. Has the situation slipped out of control? Not yet, but what certainly does not help is the flip-flopping as to what is the end game or final outcome of the war. Personally, I am hoping that the definition announced by the Pentagon, which is ridding Iran of its ability to harm its neighbors across its borders, is the mission. I think if we reach that outcome with the current regime or without the current regime, then that would be a slam dunk or a grand success for the whole region. Needless to say, I do not need to state the obvious. This war has been 11 days. It has come at a massive cost. And it is it is expected to become more expensive. It is now crystal clear that Iran's defense strategy is to make this war as expensive as possible for the United States and for everybody in the world, to try to exert pressure on the United States to stop it. And I'm referring to the deliberate attacks on oil facilities and refineries, and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, the statistics were out yesterday that out of all of the attacks, miscellaneous attacks that targeted Saudi Arabia, 36% targeted the Al Shaiba oil field in southeast Saudi Arabia. The capacity of that field is 1 million barrels a day. If you add that to 3 Gulf countries which have now completely or almost completely gone offline, I'm talking about Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain, that's a significant drop in output. Now, of course, Saudi Arabia has resorted to a contingency plan using the West-East pipeline to deliver oil through the Red Sea. But of course, we do feel bitter because we did have the Beijing Declaration, which is essentially a non-aggression treaty with Iran. And we did advise as much as we can against the consequences of waging the war in the way that it has been done.
Okay.
That said, the last point I wanted to say is up until this moment, Saudi Arabia has not engaged in the war or opened its airspace or ground. It hasn't entered the war effectively. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure we will come back to several of those points that you have just made now, Mr. Abbas. Let me now go to Ambassador Mike Guffler. What about you, Ambassador? What is the nature of the current phase of the conflict as you see it?
Well, Central Command, U.S. Central Command, where I served 2 years as the political advisor to General Petraeus about 15 years ago, is methodically eliminating Iran's capacity to act beyond its borders with military force. At this point, most of the fleet has been sunk, over 60 vessels. A large number of small boats remain. I'm sure they'll be methodically dealt with in the coming days. The air defense system is essentially non-existent, as is the Air Force. They have significant stocks of ballistic missiles left, many in very deeply buried underground storage facilities. Those are being manipulated with various kinds of ordnance, including the so-called massive ordnance penetrator, which was originally designed 15 years ago to penetrate the centrifuge rooms at Natanz. and was used in the Midnight Hammer raid last June. So Central Command is methodically moving through the Iranian military structure, eliminating it. And so the goal that Dr. Abbas spoke of, I think, is certainly going to be realized as part of this war. At the end of the war, Iran will not be capable of harming its neighbors militarily. Obviously, it's going to take a bit longer to get there. The war isn't even 2 weeks old yet. To people who are impatient because our war aims haven't been achieved yet, I would say they need to show a bit of patience. At the end of the day, the president at the beginning of hostilities said it would take 4 to 5 weeks to attain our objectives, and we're not even 2 weeks in yet. So I think that's where we are right now. I would note as well that the Iranian rate of fire has been reduced by over 90% since the beginning of the war in 12 days. So that is a positive indicator. On the negative side, they retain considerable ability to do harm throughout the region through their sponsorship of radical groups like the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. They may well have sleeper cells or agents operating in the United States and Western Europe as well. We've seen a number of terrorist attacks recently here in the United States, much more than we usually see. So I'm not totally ruling out their capacity to do harm, but it has been reduced substantially. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Norman Rule, how much trepidation do you have? How much comfort do you have that this situation is still controllable and will not slip beyond anyone's control?
Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to attend with such a group of luminaries. One correction, I do not have a PhD. I did, however, work for a living all those years and spent my time in the region acquiring different skills at the same time. The conflict has moved into a deep coercive attrition campaign at present. The center of gravity at present is Iran's ability to preserve its missile, drone, maritime, and proxy campaign sufficient to impose long-term economic, political costs faster than the U.S.-Israel campaign degrades its launchers, defense, leadership, and missile base. The conflict itself is controlled and it is even contained. The challenge is it is not entirely, the degradation of Iran's capacity is not occurring at once. It is critical that significant praise and thanks goes to Gulf partners for their extraordinary performance in their air defense. These are actors with no significant history in air defense operations, and on a 0 to 60 sort of road speed purpose. They started off and faced simultaneous ballistic missile, drone, and cyber attacks against all of their critical infrastructure and some of the world's most important systems, and they performed at just an absolutely superb rate of activity that would have challenged any partner we had in the United States, to include the United States itself. That partnership is continued with some imaginative and innovative sustenance of oil production, both the Saudis through the East-West pipeline, the Emiratis through the Fujairah pipeline, the Qataris through the maintenance of their aluminum factory. The Qatar factory is still going to partially continue to operate. The challenge for the Iranians is going to be that they must continue to form, in essence, a secondary diplomatic coalition of sorts by touching industries outside of the region, which they're doing by touching commodities, ranging from the shutoff of sulfur, other commodities that touch fertilizers, aluminum, the other industries they're moving around that touch around the world. This will put pressure on the United States to open the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. Your deciding factor is going to be the drone issue in Iran. You'll see a substantial drop-off continue of its missile program. Drones will take longer, and that will be more of a deciding factor, not so much on Gulf defenses, but on the opening of the Strait of Hormuz itself. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, so again, I'm sure we'll come back to several of those points that you raised just now, Norman Rule. Let me go to Mr. David Randell. What about you? Where do you see this whole situation going? Is it still containable, or do you have fears that it may already have begun to slip out of control?
No, I don't think it's slipped out of control. These are long-standing tensions. My expertise, as I mentioned, is really on Saudi Arabia. So I'll talk briefly about how I see that. The tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran are very long-standing and very fundamental. They have existed for decades, if not centuries. There is the Persian Shia or the Persian Arab conflict. There is the Sunni Shia conflict, which manifests itself quite often, for example, during the Hajj of sometimes the Iranians have created riots during that. There is the problem of a conservative monarchy versus a revolutionary republic. That has also had its manifestations. There was such a thing as Hezbollah of the Eastern Province. The Iranians have supported dissident movements in the Eastern Province. They have participated in the destruction of the American barracks at El Khobar. So these tensions here have been around for a long time, and you can go down the list. The Saudis are a friend of the United States. The Iranians say they're they're the sworn enemy of the United States. The Saudis tried to stabilize the Middle East by having both King Fahd and King Abdullah put forth peace plans with Israel. The Iranians say that they are the sworn enemies and they're going to destroy Israel. So these tensions are not anything new. Mike and I were both there when King Abdullah said, you have to cut off the head of the snake. Mohammed bin Salman has compared the Iranian regime to Hitler, to Khamenei to Hitler. So there is a deep, visceral antagonism there. Now, the strategy, if you can put that as the background, the strategy of the Saudis has been, if you will, the same that Barack Obama had. Barack Obama, in his Iran nuclear deal, said, I can't solve this problem, but I can kick it down the road, and hopefully it will get better in the future. This is precisely what the Saudis did with their Iranian non-aggression pact. I don't think for a moment any of them really thought that the Iranian threat was going away, but they thought that they could alleviate it for the time being. And that was fundamentally important for them, because the key for Saudi Arabia now is the success of Vision 2030. Vision 2030 is, as most of you know, is their economic and economic and social reform package. Okay, so they need money and they need stability for that to work. Stability in the Middle East so people will invest. Okay, so that is sort of where we are in terms of how we got here. Now the question, and I'll be quick and try and answer your question, is that what was the Saudi reaction to all this? The Saudi reaction to all this was actually masterful. They issued a statement which really was it could be a textbook on how to keep everybody happy. They called the attack cowardly, blatantly cowardly. I think they have cooperated with the United States in some quiet ways since they were attacked themselves. So they've kept their American allies happy. They have gotten support from their other, they've unified a response from the other GCC members and demonstrated a commitment to help them. They've kept the GCC together in its political response. They have maintained their relationship with, if you will, by China and the rest of the world, the EU, by constantly calling for de-escalation, which they have done, and called for peace. So that kept those people happy. And then they've blamed Israel and the United States for starting the war, which kept the rest of the Muslim world happy. So, so their reaction has really been one to really keep, as I say, it's a masterful statement that kept everyone more or less content with where they're at. The final thing I would say for Saudi Arabia is, what's the reaction to all this, or what has the result, not the reaction, but what has the result of all of this been? Saudis could, as I told you in the beginning, they have a long-standing tension with the Iranians. They could not do anything about that themselves. They've now had the Israelis and the United States significantly degrade Iran with very little cost to themselves. That's, again, a masterstroke. Whether they did it by strategy or just by good luck, I think it's a little bit of both. But they were very successful in that. They have eliminated to a considerable extent this Shia crescent that they were worried about in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Yemen. That has largely gone away. But just to be quick, and I know other people are going to talk about this, but the big winner, Saudi Arabia, and I'll be quick here, is that the big winner for them has been the oil. Okay, and that's the last thing I'll say, is that they, as it's been mentioned, they upgraded the IPSA 2 pipeline, which now has a capacity for 7 million barrels a day. They upgraded the loading terminals. They upgraded the storage terminals in Yanbu. And they have the capacity to do the tap line and and I said IPSA, the one they're doing is the East-West Petro line, not IPSA. IPSA 2 is still mothballed. They could upgrade that. They could open tap line in IPSA 2, and that's another 2 million. So that's 9 million barrels they could bring on. They could ship to the Red Sea, and that's almost as much as they export every day. So what's the result of that? The result of that is that while Kuwait and Iraq have basically shut down their production, the Saudis are still the only game in town. And they're not going to get benefit from the rising price, but they're also going to demand a lot of other things. I would think they're going to ask for technology transfer, security guarantees, investment, They're going to ask for a lot of things to get that oil, because everybody's going to want that oil. And then the final point that you said is, what's the reaction, or what's the danger? The danger is still there. The Iranians could use chemical or biological weapons. They could shut down the Gulf for a long time and cause a recession in the global economy. There's a lot of still dangers out there, but I think they're manageable. So anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but I think those things are what you wanted me to talk about.
Okay, great. Thank you. Your previous point about oil and energy actually provides a very smooth and natural transition to the next speaker, Dr. Sarah Vakshuri. So, Dr. Vakshuri, within the theme that we are still discussing, is the situation containable, or are events slipping beyond anyone's control? From the energy perspective, what's your answer to this question?
The answer is that it depends about the timeline of the war. So far, the market has been contained. The prices have not been acting in a shocking way. We see that anytime that the prices have hit 100, like including a few hours ago, they come back and adjust themselves for multiple reasons. Because as of now, when the war broke almost a week and a half ago, the inventories are full. The OECD inventories were full. China, the big game here, because imports most of the oil from the Strait of Hormuz, has been stockpiling for almost 2 years. And the imports of China have been higher than their actual demand, a domestic demand. So the market did not react in a shocking way that could react. The prices have so far been contained for multiple reasons. There are OPEC reports just yesterday reporting that some of the OPEC producers, including Saudi Arabia, before the war in February, extended and increased their production and export. There are multiple logistical hubs. Saudi Arabia has created a significant redundancy to increase its reliability as a supplier in the market. And when we had the 2019 attack on APCAC, we've seen that Saudi was able, despite the crisis they were facing at that time, to continuously supplying their customers through the storages that they build and export hubs around the world. So far, the market, the oil market, did not went to a significant panic mode. However, there is a lot of concern in the market. We just had yesterday the IEA members announcing that they're going to release about 400 million barrels of oil from their reserves. United States also announced that they're going to release oil from strategic petroleum reserves, which kind of gives some ease to the market that for several more weeks, the market is kind of has enough supply. And the pipeline that was Saudi pipeline, East-West pipeline, that has been discussed by other guests today. However, there are other implications. The gas market did not react in the same way. The LNG export from Qatar have not really a significant alternative for that. They have shut down their plant, so the gas market have been reacting in a more hyper sensitive than oil market. The sulfur was mentioned, the fertilizer export, the aluminum, the helium, which is very important. So there are a lot of export that going through the Strait of Hormuz, which fundamentally is going to impact global economy, food security, economic security of not just the countries in the region, but also globally. But again, different regions, different countries are going to hurt differently. United States almost has no imports of energy from the Strait of Hormuz, mostly the exports going to Asian market, China. So going back to what I mentioned first, depending on how long this war is going to last and for how long the Strait of Hormuz is going to be closed, then we're going to see the impact. What many could see is that market so far has been contained. However, we should also consider that the prices, especially in the oil market, are done by the algorithms now and not human traders. They're so sensitive to the headlines. So I could say that the headlines, if we look at how the market reacts to the current conflict, it's in two layers. Because at the current moment, the energy and oil market are facing two different threats. One is a threat on the infrastructure, which is going to actually impact the barrels, like it was mentioned, to Shaiba and other facilities in the region, which thankfully so far there was any significant impact in terms of losing actual barrels to any of those strikes. The second layer is the flow of oil and flow of energy from the Strait of Hormuz. There has been some discussions. United States announced that they're going to insure the tankers and escort them, yet even until today, that has not happened because of the sheer risk, the high cost of insurance, but also the captains and the crew do not want to go through the area that there's a missile attack, and most likely they might get hit. So again, depending on the duration, things would change.
Okay, I wanted to actually take that very point back to Mr. Faisal Abbas. Mr. Faisal Abbas, obviously the three main protagonists in this war directly involved militarily are the US, Israel, and Iran. This region is no stranger to shocks, both geopolitical and economic in terms of energy. What do you see as the biggest risk to regional stability this time around?
Look, the biggest risk to instability is, as I alluded in my first response, the lack of clarity as to how victory looks like or what is the target of the war. I reiterate, if the Pentagon's definition of ridding Iran of its ability to cause harm beyond its border is the declared mission and people can unify about that, then I think that would be a great outcome for the region for decades to come. As I said, whether that happens with this current regime, if they play ball, or if it happens with another regime, that would be a success. What irks people or what makes people nervous now is the lack of clarity, particularly that possibly the involved parties might have different points of view. I would imagine the United States would want this war to end as soon as possible and achieve its missions as soon as possible. The same might not apply, may or may not apply to the Israelis. In terms of Gulf countries, it varies to how much they can sustain. Countries that have closer proximity to Iran would like to end it tomorrow. Countries that are a bit far, if we can achieve our common objective of making the region more peaceful, more prosperous, we end these endless wars once and for all, then I think we can shoulder, we can take some of the burden and carry forward. But it is incredibly confusing to hear the contradicting messages coming out of different leaders.
In the United States, you mean, or different leaders from different countries?
In the United States, with press conferences, they seem to have, between the Pentagon and the press office of the White House, they seem to continuously dodge the question. As I said, the only thing that gives me reassurance is what the Pentagon has put out, which would be a dream come true, to be honest, for the region. And I build on what my colleagues have said. This is not a conflict that started today. This is a conflict or tension that has started 40 years ago. Let us not pretend that everything was okay and this is all a conspiracy that started 11 days ago. Not at all. We, out of all people, know exactly what the Iranian regime is capable of doing, whether itself or through its proxies. The Beijing Declaration that happened 3 years ago was an attempt to diffuse that. It was somewhat successful. I would give it 80% out of 100, which is a good outcome. My understanding is, and of course, I say that while saying that the best wars are won without fighting. If we could have achieved this with negotiations, then that would have been great. But our advice to the Obama administration when they were discussing the nuclear deal was not attended to. My understanding is and perhaps some of the other speakers here are more experts or have more insight to the most recent round of negotiations, which was spearheaded by the Omanis, which I think the kind of turning point was the ununderstandable obsession of the Iranian side with enrichment. They were simply refusing to let go of their right to enrich uranium, which was ununderstandable because you don't really need enrichment if you're going to have a peaceful nuclear program. And I think that is what turned the table on them. Of course, if you speak to the Iranians, they would likely tell you, we've been conned. This whole thing was, an attempt to distract. They were never serious about the negotiations. If I was an Iranian and I was offered a way out in return of letting go of enrichment, I would have definitely let go of enrichment.
If I may just ask you one last question before I move on to the other panelists, and I would be grateful if you could give me a concise answer so that I can take the issue to the other panelists as well. Now, cast your eyes over the long term. There are obviously a lot of fears throughout the Middle East that the Israelis have plans to expand Israel beyond where it is today to include other countries in the region. In that perspective, how much is the region, if you subscribe to that, obviously, between a rock and a hard surface, between the specter of what the Israelis may want to do down the road and what the Iranians may want to do down the road?
I smile because I wrote a column the other day called "We Are Between Iraq and a Hard Place," not a rock and a hard place. And the reason why is we've discovered that a lot of the drones that have attacked oil facilities and definitely Kuwait and some of the facilities have come from Iraqi Hezbollah in Iraq. What I'm trying to allude is that might be very well the case, but I cannot talk for people who believe in conspiracy theories. I can speak of facts. The fact is there's no Israeli missile or American missile that has hit Saudi Arabia or any of the Gulf countries. They're all either Iranian drones or missiles coming from Iran or from their militias. Now, that is in no way, shape, or form a defense of the despicable acts and statements of the current Israeli government. I just need to defer people to the things that they've said and the map of Greater Israel that is hanging behind their officials in their offices, the statements they made about expansion, their intention not to leave certain areas in the Middle East. You know, it's statements like that coming from a country that is a member of the UN definitely does not help Israel's perception in the region, and definitely does not put conspiracy theorists to rest. I am not one of them. You know, every day we try to kind of argue against them and show them facts, but the reality is conspiracy theories will always be louder. And what does not help is the atrocious statements and actions coming from the current Israeli government.
Ambassador Michael Guffala, what about you? What do you see as the biggest risk to regional stability, especially in light of what we've just heard now from Faisal Abbas?
I think the biggest risk to regional stability would be the survival of the current Iranian regime, because it will be radicalized and hardened and come back in a much worse form if it survives the war. And along with that, I would mention the survival of their nuclear program, which was damaged and set back by the Midnight Hammer raid in June, but not eliminated. They still have, by their own admission, and this is a major factor in the failure of the negotiations that Dr. Abbas mentioned, mediated by Oman. They still have over 1,000 pounds of highly enriched uranium, enriched to 60% purity. 60% purity is only a week or two away from 90% enrichment, which is weapons grade. So it seems to me that if the regime were to survive in anything like its current form, it will resume its strive for the weaponization of that uranium. It's got the know-how to build a substantial ballistic missile force. We're getting rid of the missiles, but we haven't got rid of the know-how. So it's very important for us to continue the mission until they're no longer capable of developing nuclear weapons in any way, shape, or form, and until we've dismantled their ballistic missile program. These are the two big threats. And personally, as somebody who's been watching the Iranian tragedy now for 47 years, ever since my plans to visit Iran as a young man were upended by the revolution in 1979, when I was only 22 years old, I very much hope the Iranian people succeed in ridding themselves of this regime. All of our attitudes are, impacted by our previous experiences. As a much younger man, I was on the streets in Warsaw and in Moscow when the communist regimes there were being overthrown by mass movements. Therefore, my sympathy was with the Iranians in the streets of Tehran back in January. So I hope that our current military operations pave the way for their eventual self-liberation. That's up to the Iranian people, as the president has said. It's not one of our war aims, but it's important nevertheless to the future of the Gulf. Thank you.
If I may stay with you, Ambassador, obviously, as we mentioned at the outset, you have diplomatic experience in the Gulf. Broaden the scope a little bit to the GCC. How are GCC nations balancing their traditional hedging strategies against the heightened risk of direct regional conflict, which brings us back to the issue of stability and the prospects of stability or lack thereof in the region?
I think the GCC states, as was already mentioned, have made a major contribution to this campaign through their integrated air defense systems, which they've been working on for decades. They've worked like a charm, as I believe Mr. Rule said. So that's been the major contribution so far. Obviously, their key interest is in making sure that the Straits of Hormuz are not shut for a significant period of time. I understand their reluctance to get directly involved in military hostilities at this time. They have an awful lot at risk. One of the major risks we should be looking at that hasn't been mentioned yet is their reliance on desalinated water. Saudi Arabia relies on desalination for, I believe it's 70% of its drinking water supply. In the UAE, the figure is only around 45%, but it's very high nevertheless. The shot that hasn't been fired yet is a serious Iranian assault on the desalination plants in the Gulf, because that would risk the dissolution of the Gulf societies. And so we're all playing a game of chicken here to a certain extent. The United States has escalated from one level of military action to another. The Iranians have done the same thing, even as their capacities have been degraded. But the shot that hasn't been fired yet is the desalination infrastructure. And the fact of the matter is that Iran has an advantage here because it's the only Gulf country, with possible exception of Iraq, that's not dependent on desalination for the bulk of its drinking water. And in the environments in the Gulf, human survival is possible for only 7 days without drinking water. So this is a fundamental fact. Thank you.
Mr.
Brahim, may I just come in
Yes.
very quickly with one sentence? I just
Yeah.
I forgot to say when we were talking about conspiracy theories, what also doesn't help is statements like the ones made by the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, when he says Israel has a biblical right to expand its land. So it's not just the current Israeli officials, but some American officials are also not helping in terms of conspiracy theories. Thank you.
Well, let me take that. Thank you, Mr. Abbas. Let me take that to Norman Rule. Mr. Rule, what is now your understanding of the ability of the GCC countries to conjugate their efforts in dealing with all these different strands of risk to the stability of the region? Iran, you have, as we've just heard from Mr. Abbas, we have the situation with Israel and what Mike Huckabee said. Talk a little bit about your perception of this issue.
It has improved in recent years. The Director General of the Secretary of the GCC is an exceptional individual, former ambassador to the United States, Kuwaiti ambassador, is an exceptional individual. There has been a series of integration efforts ranging from security to infrastructure development, but it remains nascent. As Ambassador Gefeller correctly stated, the ballistic missile defense efforts have been exceptional in recent weeks, but that is largely because of the cohesive efforts of CENTCOM that have been provided through the application of our geospatial constellation support structure. The Gulf Cooperation Council has failed to develop an integrated ballistic missile defense system on its own, despite multiple attempts by the United States to birth same over the past 20 years. It could and should develop an integrated ballistic missile defense system, an integrated cyber defense system, and an integrated COVID and that sort of sense system as well, given the role of major airports and the holy cities. We have watched the Iranians strike the GCC in a way that was entirely predictable. And known to GCC militaries through concentrated application of ballistic missiles, drones, and cyber attacks. The UAE, in an extraordinary performance of its own, defended off 200,000 cyber attacks, largely from Iran in the month prior to attack. In recent weeks, we have seen attacks on Iran on cyber terms from data centers to a variety of civilian architecture. You need a cohesive, coordinated approach. And there are some superb efforts being done by this. We have with us today the editor of the Arab News, and he would be the first to say that Saudi Arabia, I believe, ranks #1 in the world for cyber defense through the efforts of Musa'ad al-Iban, Dr. Iban, and his cyber defense work. But the GCC as a whole needs better integration on this. The United States has provided significant work on this assistance, but I think the GCC can do more. And at the end of this conflict, I think we're likely going to see steps by the GCC to improve its independent capacity for security integration. But that would require giving up some sovereignty to this broader organization as a whole, and that may require some tough diplomatic conversations amongst themselves as they put shared radar, shared cyber, and say some issues on pandemic aspects into a common pool of data. Thank you.
Let me I wanted to stay with you, if I may, for one more question, Mr. Rule. So how much credence do you give to what we hear sometimes coming out of the Gulf region, particularly in the media, that there's concern that these US bases, it turned out to them, to people who put forth this notion, they've proven that they are not actually there to protect the GCC. They are there to help the US launch attacks against its enemies in the region. How much credence do you give to that?
That's absurd. It's also an insult against the United States and the American men and women who have helped defend the GCC with their lives. And there are very few countries that have sent hundreds of thousands of their young men and women to put their blood on the line for the territory of another region of the world so routinely for decades, and the millions of people from other countries who live in that part of the world. But we'll move past that point. The United States has not attacked any other country during those years. We have not attacked Iran in those years. And during that time, we have prevented multiple attacks by Iran and its proxies against those countries. So it is known and frankly not known. It has not always been stated the number of attacks Iran and its proxies have attempted to undertake against the GCC through the Gulf during that history, and the presence of U.S. forces at those bases has protected those countries from that with its cooperation with local partners. Again, this isn't always public, but it's a fact. Those governments don't have those bases there because they enjoy having U.S. personnel in their countries. They have those personnel and those bases there because they see the tremendous utility. So again, I can't, as has been stated by another speaker, conspiracy theories are one thing, and that's why God invented coffee shops in the Middle East and the United States for people to waste their time chatting. But there are people who risk their lives to prevent Iran from sending small boats with explosives and other actions. And Iran likely would have attempted to attack its neighbors in the past, and particularly Bahrain has been under multiple threats in the past, as well as Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and other locations, Kuwait, Iraq. I could go on. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me go to David Randell. David Randell, I know, as you stated before, that your main expertise is Saudi Arabia. But let me also ask you about this particular dimension of the GCC situation. Obviously, as we've heard a little earlier, the GCC security architecture has been criticized by Washington for a long time now, that it should be more unified and so on. But when you look at even the security umbrella of the United States in Europe, how justified do you think is the criticism to the GCC security architecture as it exists today?
Well, I think Norm stated it very clearly that the security cooperation amongst the GCC has not been as robust as it might have been. And that's true in NATO as well, to some extent. I think it's probably, it's a fair statement that the cooperation in NATO perhaps hasn't been as robust as it should be or could be, but that's also true in the GCC. And that means that if you're trying to create an alliance, the more integrated and cooperative you are, the better you are. And I think it's also would be, I'm not an expert on NATO either, but I think there is probably more integration. In fact, I know there's more integration in NATO than there is in the GCC. So no, the GCC has not up till now integrated their security, their military. They do it more on the police side, but on the military side, they haven't upgraded their cooperation to the extent that they could have. And if I just, you asked everyone else what I think the biggest threat is now. I would say the biggest threat right now is that the United States leaves without finishing the job, and that we leave behind an angry but wounded Iran. And I think that's the big concern that we all should be watching, that we don't, if you will, bug out before this thing is resolved.
Dr. Sarah Bakhshuri, on this last point that Mr. Randell has just made, finishing the job or not finishing it, how do you see the energy situation emerging out of this current war in the Gulf, with regard to whether this will impact the global economy long term, and to what extent it may impact the global economy long term, especially if the US administration decides to stay the course and finish the war as Mr. Randell has suggested?
It's very hard to have one answer for that, because definitely we could envision multiple scenarios. So as I said, we see this risk at two layers to the market. One is the infrastructure and actual physical barrels being safe. And on the second layer is the flow of energy, oil and gas, LNG in particular. So if we look at the safety of barrels of oil and also LNG gas when it comes to physical energy assets, so far successfully, although all those strikes have somehow been mitigated. The refineries have been shut, production have been shut because the flow cannot happen. However, we haven't had a long-standing damage to infrastructure. So if we manage the infrastructure to be somehow safe as we're moving forward, and again, we have other guests here discussing that Iran's attacks are reducing, their capability to attack is reducing. The main question would be the flow of oil from Strait of Hormuz. And then when we talk about the flow of oil from Strait of Hormuz, there are multiple scenarios that we could perceive about the safety of a Strait of Hormuz and flow of the oil. With the flow of oil, both gas and everything, the whole commodities from Strait of Hormuz will go back to natural to 100%, would be resumed to a certain degree. How would US secure that? So far, the insurance and escort aids or suggestions that US proposed have not been helping or happening because of multiple reasons. First of all, the insurance amount is limited. The second important factor that we have to consider is that again, what is the scenario for endgame, as was mentioned? Is there going to be a safe Iran that is not going to constantly threaten the Strait of Hormuz or the assets, or we're having some sort of security governance in the region that is going to secure the flow of oil with the uncertainty of attacks occasionally. What is important is that majority of this energy is flowing to Asian market, non-US market, particularly China. So when we're thinking about the cost of securing these assets, ensuring these assets by the United States, we have to think about the fact that for how long the United States would be willing to use the US taxpayer, let's say, money to secure the oil that goes to China. And also another important factor to think about it is that since President Trump took office, the major threat that the United States is perceiving at this moment for its national security is not Iran per se, is the AI race with China. And in that AI race, there are multiple factors. The most important thing is access to affordable energy. We've seen that energy dominance have been the mantra of the administration. We have now a Council for National Energy Dominance. Affordability and energy abundance, energy freedom are the three keywords constantly mentioned by the administration when it comes to their energy policy. So affordable energy is what feeds the AI race. But on the other side is the critical minerals. So if we look at it, if this energy that goes to China, the cost increases for Chinese, this is the leverage. And again, we talked a lot about conspiracy theories. I'm looking at the facts and how would it be the implication for US energy dominance policy. Raising the cost of those energy for China is not going to be necessarily a loss for United States, because the LNG that goes to China is feeding directly to electricity that goes to the AI industry in China, and also multiple industries like processing the minerals, and also the oil into petrochemical. That's all the aluminium, helium that is really needed for semiconductors. These are the other factors flowing from the Strait of Hormuz. So US being there to securing a long-term flow of energy from Strait of Hormuz, if US is going to bear the cost, then there must be some I wouldn't say there must be consequences for China, but definitely is not going to be affordable energy going feeding Chinese AI industry while US is budgeting that. On the other side, if China has a pretty high dominance on on critical minerals, mines, processing, refining all of them, energy would be a leverage for United States to help the country itself and its allies to somehow balance that lack of diversity when it comes to minerals, minerals access for the whole world. Because we've seen China in multiple occasions manipulating the market, critical minerals market. So what we perceive is that whatever is the outcome of this war, it takes few weeks, few months, or if you're envisioning a long-term remaining of United States and allies for securing the region, I would say the geopolitical map, the trade of energy flow, some of those alliances that we have, the world has and perceive is going to change. And I would say a core of that would be the alliances for critical mineral supplies for the world. And we see like countries in the region, Saudi Arabia this year has been announced for a year of AI. The kingdom has been doing a lot of efforts when it comes to expanding the AI, the investment, the relation between United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia when it comes into technologies. Right. So these are all a lot of factors to include into our thinking when it comes to the geopolitics moving forward.
Understood. Mr. Faisal Abbas, back to you now. This issue of China has just come up now, as we heard from Dr. Bashkouri. What is your reading of what China has done or has not done, what China will do or will not do vis-a-vis this situation now, given that Iran is so important in the Chinese energy calculations?
I think that's a very important question, and certainly they are a key player. I think as of yesterday, they have not vetoed a UN resolution condemning the attacks on Iran, and that applies to the Russians as well. And we know the kind of tit for tat at the UN between Russia and China on one hand, on the Americans, they rarely agree on the same resolution. Look, China has to look after, I'm only assuming China will eventually have to look after its interests. So it's going to have to choose whether those interests globally, as in a steady flow of energy coming to it, its ability to export its products and services to the world is worth their backing of the Chinese. Of course, there are many elements there. China's ability to produce low-cost products stems from a number of things. One of them is cheap labor, but the other thing is they buy oil indirectly through quantities through Iran and Venezuela, and both those have now both those venues have now been closed off. So it's China is going to have to make some strategic decisions as to which side it's going to lean towards, and whether it's worth backing the Iranians all the way in this war, or hopefully this is wishful thinking, using the incredible leverage it has over Iran, over the new leadership in Iran, to talk some sense. And possibly, if the new Ayatollah agrees to negotiate and the Americans agree to negotiate, as I said in the very beginning, the best wars are won without fighting. And I completely agree with my colleagues who said the worst thing now is to go wobbly and to leave this mission unaccomplished. But if we can leave with the current regime adhering or committing to stopping its aggression, to abandoning enrichment, to abandoning its ballistic missile, and stopping the support of the militias, then it would be mission accomplished. China might have the leverage to be able to speak to Iran, not because they're good people. I mean, I'm sure some of them are good people, many of them are good people, but because it's in their interest as well.
Ambassador Michael Guffler, what about you? Given how important Iran is for the Chinese, and especially for their energy and other economic needs in the present and the future, how do you rate the Chinese approach to the current war now, given that everybody, almost everybody, agrees that at the end of the day, what's going on with the United States in Iran, the ultimate goal is China rather than just Iran?
Yes, well, I'm not sure I would agree with that last statement, but regarding the Chinese and their energy balances, the biggest development I've seen in recent years, aside from this war, was the development of the Sino-Russian axis, which Henry Kissinger warned against so many years. Um, I worked for Kissinger for a number of years, and he always used to say, every time I met with him, he would say, Ambassador Feller, the one thing we can't permit is a strategic alliance between Beijing and Moscow, and that's what we have now. So the easiest move for the Chinese at this point is to boost energy imports from Russia, which they'll do, of course. With the loss of Iran and Venezuela, Moscow's leverage over China has increased. This is an alliance based on a cold calculation of each country's interests. There's no love lost between Beijing and Moscow. Moscow will demand smaller discounts in terms of its energy pricing vis-a-vis China, and they'll get it. So Russia will make more money on its oil and gas exports to China, and the Chinese will have to pay a larger bill, which they'll do, because at the end of the day, from a geopolitical perspective, the safest connection, energy connection for China right now is imports from Russia. That will, of course, impact the war in Ukraine because heightened Russian energy income will boost their ability to maintain their military effort in Ukraine for a considerable period of time. I don't think the war is going to last that long, so I think this advantage that's accruing to the Russians right now will be temporary in nature and probably short-term in nature. But right now, what I see is a strengthening of China's dependency on Russia for oil and gas supplies.
What about you, Norman Rule? Do you lose much sleep about, this Sino-Russian access that Ambassador Gaffala has just mentioned in this particular crisis? I know that, there've been some reports that the Russians have been supplying intelligence to the Iranians. But do you lose much sleep about this connection between Russia and China, given that they both have interests in Iran?
The ambassador has characterized it accurately. Russia's and China's relationship with Iran are well known and operating within predictable parameters. Russia took Iranian drones, modified them at factories in Russia, made them more lethal, more accurate, and returned them to Iran. What is hitting the Gulf states today is a more accurate version of the Shahad 136. In essence, it's the result of Russian technological improvements. Reports of Russian imagery and other intelligence provision to the Iranians, as confirmed by the administration publicly, also reflects longstanding Russian intelligence relations with Iran. There's nothing new there. And again, Russia's influence in the region is marginal generally politically. It's a malign and vindictive actor playing a role on OPEC plus negotiations, but largely irrelevant to most regional issues. China has a very modest political footprint. The Iran Saudi deal was primarily brokered by Saudi Arabia and the Iranians together, and was just finalized with the Chinese help as a way of bringing China in for some pressure on Iran. It wasn't of great influence. The Chinese make a lot more money in the Gulf than they do with the Gulf states than they do with the Iranians. But we need to keep in mind that if you have a Belt and Road initiative from the East China Sea to the Mediterranean, you do need the territory of Iran. So the Chinese do need to have an arrangement of sorts with Iran in the end. They'll try to retain the commercial agreements, the energy agreements, and stay within that boundary, and then let the United States deal with the security and the messier aspects. At the same time, they will watch this conflict very carefully. and try to acquire intelligence lessons and watch our weapon systems in play and see what lessons can be learned. They and the Russians for a Pacific war or any other conflict that might take place with our forces.
And if I may stay with you, so when we talk about the impetus, if there is impetus on the side of the Trump administration to end this conflict, and I think one of you alluded to this earlier in this conversation, is it going to be because, in your opinion, the administration will have believed that enough of Iranian war capabilities have been demolished, or because of the issue of energy and how it may impact the U.S. Domestic scene, especially that the U.S. is about to have an election in a few months for Congress?
The conflict as a whole, again, I do not comment on U.S. political issues. It's not my area of expertise, but the conflict as a whole will have a negative impact on the administration's political standing in the U.S. just historically, and speaking in general terms, unless it ends very quickly. I think that's a general statement. This said, because of our energy independence, our general vulnerability is more on global markets and how the ancillary inflationary aspects from the commodities, aluminum and fertilizer, helium, all the other issues that come from the Gulf spread out into other areas, as well as the political and diplomatic reflections that come from this. This said, so I don't see that as a major issue. Remember, the United States does not seek energy control. We seek energy access. Even in Venezuela right now, you have the United States having no objection if Venezuela and Chevron continue to support the sale of energy in Venezuela to China. That has not stopped. The United States has never blocked the sale of energy in the GCC to Asia and China. That we never, in its history, we don't attempt to control the sale of energy. This said, the Trump administration has been consistent that its primary goals have been to end Iran's capacity to build a nuclear weapon, to end its missile threat of its increasing sophistication of its medium-range ballistic missiles and its development of an intercontinental ballistic missile system, and to significantly degrade its capacity to revive its proxies in the region. The challenge is at the end of this, if you retain the government in place led by the new supreme leader, who I believe is about to make a statement, and the current government, the government is probably going to try to rebuild that in the future. We could end up in a situation not so different from the past, although it will take the Iranians some more years to do so because of the tremendous financial commitment they would have to make to do so. That could imply a new security arrangement will be required in the region involving the United States and other partners to prevent that from happening. So I think there's a broader, more complicated picture response to your question than may have been anticipated.
Okay, David Rundell, back to the specific issue of Iran now, and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and Iran, as we all know, restored diplomatic ties not long ago. How has this conflict changed the nature of the relationship with Iran? How do you think it may change the relationship with both the US and China, since we're talking about widening the lens?
How will it change the relationship between Saudi Arabia and China?
Yeah.
Well, this relates to the question that other people have answered. China is the world's largest importer of oil. They're heavily dependent on Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's largest customer is China. I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think Mike is right that they're going to try and import more oil from Russia, but that will take time. So I don't see that the commercial relationship between Saudi Arabia, once the straits are opened again, or even if they're not, because as I pointed out earlier, as other people as well, the Saudis have a pipeline. They can get this oil to the Red Sea, so that they can. And the other point is, as far as I know, the Chinese are still getting oil from Iran, that the Iranians have closed the Straits of Hormuz for everybody except themselves. So they're still shipping oil to China. So the bottom line there is that China is heavily dependent for its industrial might, if you will, its industrial prowess on imported oil. And while they're trying very hard to shift that to coal, and they're succeeding, and that's something that people don't talk about often, but all their aversion on electric cars is really just changing themselves from gasoline powered cars to coal fired cars. But in any event, so I don't see the relationship between Saudi Arabia and China changing. The relationship to the United States, well, I've watched that for 40 years. That's a solid relationship. It goes up and down, but it stays within a band. The interests of the United States and the interests of Saudi Arabia are fundamentally aligned. Both of them are status quo powers. Both of them want stability in the Middle East. Both of them want stability in the oil markets. So no, I don't think that this war is going to change fundamentally change the relationship with either the United States or China. Saudi Arabia has good relations with both of them, and they're going to keep having good relations with both of them.
Let me ask you a follow-up, because I want to come back to the issue of Saudi Arabia and Iran a little bit later on. But just based on what you said just now, we don't know, obviously, where or when President Trump may call an end to the war. But what do you make of the Washington Post report that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman advocated for this war during 4 phone calls with Trump over the last month? What do you think the Crown Prince may have actually advocated in those calls? Don't we have a better idea than what the Washington Post reported?
Let's be clear. I don't know what the Washington Post, how accurate that report is. What I would say is that the Saudis have for a long time, as I mentioned, MBS and King Abdullah have both made it very clear that they view Iran as a long-term threat. So if they called and said that that was the case, that would not be anything new. But I also think you need to put this into perspective, that the decision of the Trump administration was not made because MBS called them. There were many factors that led to this. And, the fact that the negotiations that Mr. Witkoff was carrying out, where they offered the Iranians the enriched uranium for a civilian program and they were rejected, the fact that the Iranians wouldn't even talk to the Americans directly, I think the negotiations were failing, and that was pretty clear. The IAEA then came out and stated that they could no longer state that the Iranians were not pursuing some kind of a nuclear program, that there's some sort of if you read the report, some sort of a new discovery that they had found that the Iranians would not give them access to. The fact that the regime was now particularly weak economically and facing internal tensions, the fact that the Israelis have been pushing for a strike on Iran for a long time. So there were many factors that led to this, and I think it would be misleading to claim that MBS called up and that was the reason that this war took place. May have been a contributing factor, but it was hardly the decisive one.
Okay, Dr. Vashkouri, please bear with me. I would like to quickly go back to Mr. Faisal Abbas on this issue of Saudi Arabia and Iran and their restored diplomatic ties. They were restored not long ago. So, Mr. Abbas, I put this question to you specifically about Iran. How has this conflict changed the nature of that relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran, do you think?
Look, time will tell, and it will depend on how this war ends. As I said, we have been at the receiving end, and we are probably the most experienced with dealing with the Iranian threats and malign activities for about 40 years. There's been a huge achievement that was done in the Beijing Declaration. It's far from being perfect, but it, as one of my colleagues said earlier, for Vision 2030, we need 2 things. We need foreign direct investment, and we need stability in the region. And the leadership took a decision to prioritize stability. So the agreement with Iran at the time was like, look, you guys want to stay in 1979, that is completely up to you. We are going to 2030. You want to join us, you're more than welcome. Just don't drag us back. To somewhat, that was a victory in a way that we've managed to achieve some of our goals without fighting. Now, What has happened 10 days ago is a game changer in the sense that the new leadership in Iran, the new Ayatollah, which is yet to make an appearance or make a statement, is yet to be tested. Does he want to continue what his father had started and say, Saudi Arabia could be our friend and we should not include it? That's presuming the regime survives. My assumption is if that scenario happens, it's kind of unlikely, but if it does happen and the regime survives and agrees to halt its hostile activities, be it the ballistic missiles, be it the enrichment, be it the militias, then everybody can walk out a winner and we can end this war quickly. If the regime does not survive, and there are two outcomes, there are two likely outcomes. Either whoever comes next is better, in which case we have no problem, or whoever comes next is worse. And then we go back to square one, and we go back to essentially the breakpoint in 1979, and we start all over again. But I want to agree with the conclusion that one of my colleagues have made, which is the worst thing now is to go wobbly and stop the war before the threat of Iran has been eliminated, because it will come back like an injured lion, injured and angry lion.
Dr. Bashkouri, now, regardless of what happens in this current war, regardless of which way the the Saudi-Iran relationship goes, what do you see as the implications of whatever happens now between Saudi Arabia and Iran, not just in terms of energy, but in terms of geopolitics?
Before I respond to this question, I want to reference some point that was mentioned that U.S. was never looking for oil in terms of dominating that. I want to say that there has been this change. Definitely, United States never blocked or had the history of blocking the oil, but it's obvious that international access and leverage is important for United States, and for this war. Venezuela was very clear. President Trump has been very honest about it, that the oil access in Venezuela is important, and minerals. And about this war, the director of Council for National Energy Dominance, he said that quote him that this war is about oil to free the oil from terrorists. So definitely energy is one aspect of this war. Regarding Iran and Saudi Arabia relation, I tend to interpret things in the lens of energy security and global energy security. Saudi Arabia has been long very reliable source when it comes both in relation with investors. We have seen how the energy has been nationalized in multiple countries in the region and the world, but Saudi Arabia had very much different approach toward international investment since the beginning, and also through the resiliency and supply to the customers that it had always. Nevertheless, I would say, just reference to Mr. Abbas' point that about the reducing the escalation and the importance of stability for Vision 2030. And Saudi Arabia is not alone in this. Most of the countries in the region have a vision for their economics expansion, and for that vision, they need investment. They need stability, and I would say a world 2 months ago for them, the region was more stable than it is today when it comes for their investments. So definitely this war did not help, even though that Iran was potentially a threat to many countries like Saudi Arabia. But 2 weeks ago, the world in terms of their progress into their vision was much safer than it is today. So the end of this war in a way that the security and the stability of the region is guaranteed. And also the other factor is how much money they have to spend for security of the country, of the region. That's also another factor, because a lot of that energy income that they had was going to be reinvested in diversifying their economy for their progress, future progress. Now do they have to spend portion of that again for securing their neighborhood? In terms of higher prices, United States, yes, we have election, short-term pain for long-term gain. Definitely higher prices is going to help boosting the shale production in the United States. Also, uncertainty in, let's say, Middle East is going to definitely incentivize the investment in Venezuela, in shale. So while United States, Saudi Arabia, and most of the countries, the Arab countries in the Gulf are allied, definitely the end of this war in a manner of secured Middle East and secured region, that the investment is guaranteed, flow of energy is guaranteed, is a win for everybody.
And as a follow-up to you again, Dr. Vashkouri, we heard, as we heard a little while ago, so there is new leadership in Iran now, and this new leadership emerged after the decapitation, outside decapitation efforts. How do you think the Iranian people are likely to react to that outside decapitation over time?
I would say that there was a lot of discussion of Iran, how Iran treated its neighbors. I would say, unfortunately, inside Iran have also been victim of this hostile attitude. And what we've seen in January was mentioned already by one of the guests here today. It was really maximum atrocity toward its own people, and so definitely the people inside the Iran have suffered a lot. Have been suffering the attitude, because it seems that to me, just looking how the events in January folded themselves, that when the Iranian regime, at least through the previous leadership, we don't know yet about the leadership, as was mentioned, if I want to be fair and neutral and distinguish them. But the regime in overall, when they feel their survival is at risk, they go into the mode of maximum violence. Either it's through their people, which we've seen that they use their own militia to come. They brought them to Iran to kill the protesters, that they were like unarmed and they were just protesting for their economic situation, or retaliating on the neighbors to defend themselves, and creating that panic and forcing everybody to somehow live with the maintenance of the regime, and somehow think that living with them is better than dealing with their violence. So it's very hard. I feel that Iranian must have mixed feelings. Definitely, the bombing is not also comfortable for people. It's even though they've seen that the regime is being weakened, there are historical places being damaged, hospitals, schools, and the life is not normal for Iranian people too. But unfortunately, I would say that the same way that the countries in the region have been stuck in this conflict, people in Iran, same suffering.
Abdurrahim,
Doctor,
may I just
yeah, go ahead.
Just to build up on an excellent point that Dr. Vashkouri has raised about the importance of stability in the region. This is actually the best argument against the Washington Post report you referred to. Of course, it has been publicly denied by the spokesperson of the Saudi embassy in Washington. And in private meetings, I can also confirm from senior officials that that story is not true. And the context here is, it does not make sense for a vision that's relying on development to have a regional war. That said, the Saudi position is also, we don't fear war. We want stability. We would rather have it through peace. But I think the biggest concern is to go wobbly and to be left with chaos, because this thing breaks, it's going to be left to the region to pick up the pieces, and we still have nightmares of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya.
I was actually going to ask you about that, Mr. Abbas, Iraq. I was going to ask you, in the midst of this situation with Iran now, how much is the 2003 invasion of Iraq and its chaotic aftermath, how much of that is still on the minds in the GCC?
Very much so, very much so. And, contrary to what has been reported, my understanding, at least from what I've been briefed, is that the conversations were headed in another way. That, if you're going to do this, make sure that the mistakes that have happened in Iraq don't be repeated. Let us not forget, Saddam was a monster. The Saddam regime was awful, but the outcome was the creation of Daesh and Iranian intervention and influence in Iran. So, there's no point crying over spilt milk. As I said, not even I said, Sun Tzu, the writer of The Art of War, says the best wars are won without fighting. We would have loved for this to be solved and Iran to become, a good neighbor in the country without fighting. But now that we're in this, the worst possible outcome is for an Iraq scenario to be repeated, and that there is no plan for the day after. That is the biggest concern in the region.
So, how do you think, very quickly, how do you think the US could reconcile its interests peculiar to it in this war in Iraq with the interests of either Israel or the GCC countries, given these concerns that you've just outlined now with regard to Iraq in after 2003?
Look, Israel and the Gulf countries might have very different priorities. And when I say Israel, I don't mean the country. I mean this current government headed by Netanyahu and his League of Extraordinary Gentlemen that are wanted for war crimes and say outrageous things. They might have an agenda that is very different than us. They might not feel the pinch as much as we do. It might be in Netanyahu's interest, may or may not be in Netanyahu's interest to prolong the war. It is definitely not in the interest of GCC countries. The last thing I saw was a phone call between the Saudi Foreign Minister and Secretary Marco Rubio with an agreement to enhance Saudi defenses. I think most GCC countries are now focusing on enhancing defenses. There is an unconfirmed report from the Kiev Independent about procuring anti-drone technology from Ukraine. One element of the war is we've covered a lot, but perhaps we didn't get to, is the economics. When you fire a $4 million Patriot missile to bring down a $20,000 Shahed drone, over time that becomes expensive. Of course, some countries are using helicopters. The new development there are talks yet to be confirmed, of course, that Sting drones developed in Ukraine, which cost as little as $2,000, which are artificially intelligent enabled, that can attach themselves to the Shahed drones and dismantle them or eliminate the threat, are being purchased, and that will be a game changer.
Right.
I think we are very well aligned with the United States, as long as what I've described earlier, which is the mission from as stated by the Pentagon, is adhered to, and the goalposts don't keep changing.
So the issue that you've raised just now about the cost of military hardware, it takes me back to the previous question that I put to the panel earlier. Now, the Trump administration, will it end this war because it feels that it has attained all its objectives, or because of pressure from the cost of the war, energy, and so on and so forth? And I wanted to finish, because we only have about 2 minutes left, this conversation with a question to Ambassador Gaffola. Basically, how does the US reconcile its own interests in this war with the interests of some of its allies, including the Saudis, as we heard from Mr. Abbas?
Well, to answer your question directly, I think the war will end when President Trump judges that he's reached his military objectives. In other words, when Iran is no longer capable of threatening its allies in the region, that obviously will be deeply and profoundly in the interest of the GCC countries, including Saudi Arabia. And I think we're rapidly approaching that day. I would also refer back to some comments made a few seconds ago by some of our other participants. And
in less than a minute, please.
The United States is using advanced electronic warfare technology against this drone threat. including EMP, electromagnetic pulses, and artificial intelligence to confuse and disable Iranian electronic warfare. Just a technical addition there. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. With that, we come to the end of this webinar. I am very grateful to the speakers, Mr. Faisal Abbas, Editor-in-Chief, Arab News Saudi Arabia, Ambassador Michael Guffler, independent consultant on international politics and economics, former Chargé d'Affaires, U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, Mr. Norman Rule, non-resident senior advisor, Center for Strategic and International Studies, former Iran intelligence manager, Directorate of National Intelligence, Mr. David Randell, author of Vision of or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads, former Chief of Mission, U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, and Dr. Sarah Bakshuri, Center for Energy Security and Diplomacy Chair, Institute for World Peace, founder and president, SVB Energy International. Thank you also for everyone who's followed this conversation, wherever they may be in the world. My name is Abdulrahim Fuqara. It's been my absolute pleasure to moderate this very important panel, basically organized by the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations. Thank you all very much.
On behalf of the board and staff of the National Council of U.S. Arab Relations, I'd like to thank you all again for attending our webinar. Today's discussion was incredible, and it shed a lot of light on the evolving dynamics of war and peace for the Gulf and the profound implications for all of us of these developments on the front lines affecting this pivotal region, which is pivotal not just for the world, but pivotal for the United States, even if it took this conflict and this tragedy for us to understand that better. We thank you all for your interest, your attention, your questions. Thanks again to our superb moderator, Abdurrahim Fuqara, and for this highly distinguished council. We will be offering Norman Rule an honorary doctorate today for his accomplishments. I'm your host, William Lawrence. I encourage you to support the National Council, which for 40 years has been one of the leading educational nonprofits in the United States dedicated to improving American awareness, knowledge, and understanding of the Arab world, and by extension of the Middle East and the Islamic world. And if I may add, improving regional awareness, knowledge, and understanding of Washington, as we do in our summer leadership program. Please donate to the Council on our website and join us in our programs. This program will be on our website in the next couple of days. Please stay informed, stay engaged, and we hope to see you at future events. Please keep the Gulf region in your hopes and prayers, and have a good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, and may you and your loved ones remain safe and secure. Thank you.
Thank you.